We're going to investigate a number of design eras in this class. This might seem a little strange in what's ostensibly a technology class, but I'm hoping to show you how connected technology and design and society are. And we'll talk about that quite a bit as we go through the content for the class. Design is something that has existed, obviously, since the beginning of humanity. We could easily have started our first era with cave drawings and so forth, but perhaps a better place to start is the Victorian era. This is the first era heavily influenced by the Industrial Revolution and is therefore probably something that we can relate to some degree or another from the standpoint of the 21st century. The Victorian era is named after Queen Victoria of Great Britain. She ruled over an unprecedented time of technological and societal change. At the beginning, the Industrial Revolution was just in its infancy. There were very few factories, and most of the work was still unmechanized. And science and technology were primitive at best. By the end of her very long life, the population of Britain had doubled, mostly due to advances in technology and science and medicine. As the technological prowess of the nation increased, their influence on the rest of the planet increased as well. This is when the British Empire got so large they said the sun never set on the British Empire because there was always some part of it that was in daylight because it spanned the entire world. This is a time of prosperity and improvement. They called it Pax Britannica, or the British Peace, which is after the Roman origin of that term, which meant that everything was peaceful and great as long as you were part of the British Empire, or at least friendly to it. So this is a time of technological change. It was the age of steam. Steam engines were some of the first non-animal powers or sources of power, and more importantly, they were mobile. This led to a great expansion in transportation. Ships and trains and even cars were able to utilize steam engines. Travel times were shortened significantly, and materials could easily be moved from their source to factories and then on to consumers. And that's a really big deal because it used to be that you had to put the factory right next to where you were getting, your materials out of a mine or whatever, and hopefully there was a water source there and so forth. But with steam engines, the entire country can become part of that production. The use of electricity was also first developed during this time. And again, this had a huge impact on society as motive power could be sent flowing along those magic little metal wires. Steam engines, have largely been supplanted by the internal combustion engine and other technologies, but it's nearly impossible to conceive of anything even remotely resembling the modern world without electricity. Chemistry was another area of rapid development during this time, and from a design standpoint, these advances led to new and more inexpensive dyes and inks. That's a big part of this, and so much of the gaudy design and colors of the time were due to just the fact that these colors were available for the first time to the mass market. We saw this continuing well into the 21st century. I can remember as a kid. In the 80s and early 90s with all the neon colors that suddenly were everywhere. And a lot of that was just because it was now cheap to produce those, and it was possible. Well, the same kind of thing in the Victorian era. Communications also changed a great deal during this period. The advances in transportation obviously meant that traditional postal mail was far more efficient, but it was the introduction of the telegraph and later the telephone that had the most profound change. Now, never before had long-distance communication of this sort been possible. A distance of even a few miles would make a two-way communication mean that you had to move one human being somewhere close to the other human being so that they could talk. Now you could send a message instantly across the whole nation and eventually across the whole world. And this revolutionized the organizational abilities of governments and companies and militaries. This was really setting the foundations for the modern world. It's hard to imagine a world without those technologies in it. And finally, we have medicine. The mechanization of agriculture combined with new medicines led to what I mentioned before about the population of the nation and of much of the world doubling during this time. Fewer people died from what we now consider to be preventable diseases, and more people had access to quality nutrition. And for the first time ever, most children could expect to grow up and have enough to eat. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. So let's look at some of the designs of people from this time. So one of my favorite individuals from this time period is a guy named Joseph Bazalgette. He's really one of my heroes. He's one of those individuals that most people have never heard of, and yet his work affects us every single day in the modern world. Bazalgette was an engineer, and his big contribution was a solution to a horrific problem facing London in the middle of the 1800s. They called it the Big Stink, and it was a result of using the main river flowing through London, the Thames, as an open sewer system. At this time, people deposited their output in the streets, and eventually it flowed into the river. And when you combine this with a major metropolitan area full of horses, you can imagine just how awful it must have smelled. But this was more than just a matter of an unpleasant odor. London was hit with wave after wave of just terrible diseases. Tens of thousands of people were dying from things like malaria and dysentery. And at the time, the leading medical thought on the matter was that the bad smell was actually what caused the disease. So, and in fact, the word malaria comes from the Latin words for bad air. And so to solve this problem, Bazalgette was hired to create a system for London that would take the filth, and therefore the disease, away from the city. And in doing so, he invented the modern underground sewer system with pumps and all these kind of things. And this transformed London. The waves of disease stopped, and the city became a healthy place to live. This was a major, major change and allowed London to grow into the financial center of the world that it was, because they got a sewer system before everybody else. So this is one of those stories about technology that I really, really love. Here's a guy that's solving a problem based on incorrect thinking. And in doing so, he accidentally solves the real problem. Of course, we know now that the smell didn't cause the disease. It was germs in the water. But they didn't know about germs at this time. And they couldn't miss the stink. So they solved the problem of the smell and flushed away the germs right along with it. And so often technological advance is portrayed as this linear process. You identify a problem, you engineer a solution, and there is no step 3. You solved it. That's all there is to it. Problem, solution. But in reality, the advancement of technology is messy and imperfect and always ongoing. And so I love that about this, that they were trying to solve a problem. They didn't really know what was going on, but they accidentally solved the actual problem that was facing them. That's just wonderful. Now, when you look at this image, you see a very ornate room. And perhaps you think it's part of a cathedral or a museum or something like that, government building. Nope. This was one of Joseph Bazalgette's sewage pumping stations. Now, why was it so ornate? It was because it was a marvel of the age. If you put yourself in the life of a person at this time, think of the change that modern sanitation would bring to your life. Your children would grow up healthy. You wouldn't be faced with the constant smell of human output everywhere. And you could get on with other pursuits in life other than trying to, get through all this muck. And so they venerated this technology as much as we do the internet or mobile technology or anything like that. And so, today we take sewers for granted, and we certainly wouldn't decorate them like this. But I wonder what, it makes me wonder, like we really think a lot of the internet and mobile technology and things like that now, but it makes me wonder what, people in 100 years are going to think about us and think, wow, wasn't that quaint that they were so impressed with, the totally mundane things of the internet and smartphones and whatever it is that comes next. Kind of makes you a little, gives you a little bit of humility when we think about how great we are at this point in history. Here's another image of a technological marvel from that age. It's the Eiffel Tower, of course. And even in today's world of megastructures, this is still really impressive. It was only possible due to improvements in metals and production, and it was meant to show the world just how awesome French people and their engineering were. In the detailed view, you can see, kind of those ornate embellishments and so forth in the design. And like I said, even in the modern world, this is a tremendously impressive thing. I've actually been there myself, and it's really something to stand at the bottom of it, and it's really something to see from higher up. Now, in the United States, we mostly associate Victorian design with houses, Victorian-style houses. This example shows, again, the ornate decorations and how the design is complex, and it's meant to show the wealth of the owner. In this case, they're probably just a middle-class person, but, they were living a lifestyle that was well beyond anything that anybody that was super wealthy before could have had. And we have lots of examples of this in the Midwest as well. Now, Victorian design is still seen as beautiful today, and it's not without its detractors. It's often criticized as being too busy and commercial and not real art. And it's easy to think this looking back on the era, but from their perspective, this was a way to show the spread of wealth. Even the poor had access to things that the rich from a few generations before didn't have. So this era saw the first experiments in modern production methods and lots of people having access to goods and services. And, as with any other time in history, it was a reaction to previous eras. In the past, they saw the past as harsh and primitive, but science and technology were improving the world in every way imaginable. And so they were very, this is a very positive, forward-looking time. It's strange to think about this now, but, in our advertising-saturated modern world, but there was a time when people had to be taught how to buy things. It was all well and good that you make all these things in factories and they were cranking out goods left and right, but if people didn't know that they needed to buy them, then it was, kind of pointless. And so, people had to be shown that their life was lacking in some sort, and they needed to buy these products to make it better. And thus, modern advertising was born. So these examples show, examples of trying to convince people to buy things that they didn't know they needed before. These examples show some very ornate designs that were so popular at this time. The one on the left is not terribly readable, but at least they made use of every bit of that very expensive paper at the time. The second design shows something near and dear to my heart. It's hot sauce. And you look at the logo, and it even looks familiar today. And speaking of designs that are familiar, some of these logos from the Victorian time are largely unchanged clear into the 21st century, like the Campbell Soup there and General Electric. I include this one just because it's weird. And one misconception that we often have about people from the Victorian era is that they were all very serious and somewhat sour people, but this notion is a rather interesting side effect of the photographic technology used at the time. You see, cameras at the time, you needed a long exposure to get a clear picture, and so, try imagine, sitting there for half a minute with a smile on your face. It's not easy. And so for the most part, people had to sit very still for the picture to turn out well. And so as the result is that, over 100 years later, after all these people are long gone, we think they never smiled. However, they were just like us. And I found this collection of pictures that shows Victorian people smiling and behaving like people do now, just to kind of show their humanity. The style of the Victorian era is still very much used now to kind of give a feel for that time. This is a poster from the 2012 Olympics in London. Another interesting use of this era is in steampunk design. This is something that's kind of cool. It combines modern technology and science fiction and the style of the Victorian era. And there's numerous books and comics and movies that use this kind of style. There are even computers that are retrofitted to look as if they came from this era. Kind of cool. Not sure how usable it is, but it is pretty.